Hospitals are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and are supposed to be places of healing and rejuvenation. For most, a stay in a hospital could range from a few hours to several weeks, or even months depending on the state of health of the individual. While science, medicine, and technology provide us with state-of-the-art methods for treating illnesses once considered incurable, it's not infallible, and death inevitably finds us all at one point or another. When tragedy strikes, not all who enter the hospital depart on their way to recovery. Skeptics can be quick to let us know that science offers no proof of life after death, and many find comfort in religious beliefs concerning end of life. Even if you're not religious, we know that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So what happens to the energy that gives us life when it departs our bodies? Do we, as a consciousness, cease to exist, never again possessing the ability to interact with the living? Or do we still sometimes linger? Today's guest has some insight to these buildings we call hospitals, which contain more than their fair share of trauma, despair, and death within their walls. Mark Leslie is the co-author of Haunted Hospitals, Eerie Tales about Hospitals, Sanatoriums, and Other Institutions, and he joins me today on this week's episode of Deviatus. Well, I'm really excited today to speak with our guest. I personally have been working in hospitals for over 20 years now, and I've had my share of paranormal experiences during that time. Mark Leslie is here. He's the co-author of Haunted Hospitals, Eerie Tales about Hospitals, Sanatoriums, and Other Institutions. Mark, thanks for joining us today, and welcome.
Oh, thanks so much, Jeremy. It's great to be on the show.
Well, before we dive into hospitals, can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe what made you interested in the paranormal?
Yeah, well, I've always been afraid of the monster under the bed. You can't tell me that the monster under the bed doesn't exist, because I'm sure he's there. We just haven't found him yet. So I've always been afraid of the dark. I've always been susceptible to the thrill of the campfire ghost story, and I've always had an inkling towards those sorts of things. So it was actually in Ottawa, oh God, it must have been 15, 20 years ago, when I went on my very first ghost walk, a historic ghost walk of the downtown area. And Ottawa is the capital city in Canada, our version of Washington. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's a beautiful city with a lot of history. And going on the ghost walks, so there's the person in the Victorian garb with the robes, and they have the beautiful old lantern, and they take you on a walking tour. And you not only learn the ghost stories, which are the draw for people, but in order to appreciate the ghost stories, you learn so much about the history and the culture of the area. And I learned so much about my own country, and I learned so much about the formation of the city of Ottawa. And I realized for the first time in my life that history could actually be interesting. It was never a topic that I enjoyed at school at all. It was probably one of my worst grades. Was in history class, because I was the typical, well, it happened a long time ago, why does it matter now? And so that was my first appreciation of history. And now, I mean, when I travel, is one of the things that I enjoy most about a city is finding the old buildings and finding the legacy and learning those stories. And with those old stories often come some amazing eerie tales or ghostly tales. Mm-hmm. And so those two passions combined, I've always written fiction, and my fiction, I call it Twilight Zone fiction, because it's not quite science fiction, it's not quite fantasy, it's more speculative, more like horror-ish or weird, strange things that happen. And so with my very first book, Haunted Hamilton, it was my attempt to try to collect some of the stories that I had appreciated of the city that I lived in. And I knew there was never a book like that. So there's, all those passions sort of combined, and it seemed to be the right place at the right time when a publisher was looking for a book of ghost stories about Hamilton. And I had a whole bunch of great stories that I collected. That was really, really fun. So that's kind of how I got started, at least with my publisher, doing these, every year, putting out a new book on the paranormal.
Now, this book coming up, the Haunted Hospitals book, is that fiction or nonfiction?
Oh, it's nonfiction. So all of my ghost story books are nonfiction, or as the master gatherer, collector, John Robert Colombo, who's a mentor of mine, who does a lot of haunted Canadian ghost stories. He calls them, and he holds up his fingers to do air quotes, tales told as true, meaning you report the stories that people share with you, and they're not fiction. They're not stories that people made up. But they're stories that have happened to people, or that people have experienced, and they're real experiences. And what I like about that approach is you can tell a story about a haunting or a ghost or an eerie supernatural occurrence or something that just can't be explained. And the believer has enough elements in the story that they enjoy the ghost. And the non-believer also can appreciate the story, because they can look at the story and still enjoy enough elements of it to satisfy their own bias towards the story. So I try to approach these true ghost stories with a journalistic integrity where I report the facts. But of course, as a natural-born storyteller, I can't help but want to draw out the eerie and leave the reader feeling chilled and disturbed and questioning things. Because in a lot of cases, you can't explain what it is that happened, just that this thing happened to somebody.
I agree. I mean, I've like I said, I've worked in hospitals for a really long time, and specifically in hospitals or even not in hospitals, I find that a really good ghost story doesn't need a lot of fiction added in order to give you that sense of the creeps.
No, you're right. There's the folks from the Haunted Hamilton Ghost Walks always say that, regardless of whatever story you hear, it always starts with the proper kernel of truth. Mm-hmm. And so even in the stories that I share, is sometimes when somebody shares a story with me, they share, like a bullet point list of elements. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And if I were to just write the list of things that happened, it wouldn't, it'd be interesting, but it wouldn't be a narrative. And I like stories to have a beginning and a middle and an end. So sometimes you have to set up the scene. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, you're saying, okay, this happened to you here. Well, tell me about here. What is here, and who are you, and why are you there? And I think one of my favorite examples was a UFO chapter in the book Spooky Sudbury, mm-hmm. where basically it was a gentleman who contacted me and said, "Oh my God, it was in the 70s. I was hunting with my friends. We woke up in the middle of the night. The light was the sky was lit up with these giant bright lights, like it was the middle of daylight. Suddenly all the sounds of the forest completely quieted, and then 30 seconds later they disappeared, and it was back to pitch black." And that was all he told me. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, "Oh, that's cool. But that'll be 100 words." So I asked him questions, and I said, "Well, okay, so it was the 70s. Tell me about the hunting trip." Well, he says, "Well, it was my first hunting trip. I'd never gone hunting, and I grew up in northern Ontario, and riding a snow machine and fishing and hunting were very much a rite of passage for a youth. So knowing that from my own youth, my very first hunting trip, the very first time I went camping overnight, it was a very much of a coming of age thing. So I was able to write the chapter, from the point of view that he's scared and nervous as a young man, 17 years old, never gone hunting before. This is his first trip. So I was able to build some suspense, and I just assumed this. And then even when they woke up in the middle of the night, well, I assumed they also were playing poker and drinking beer around the campfire and telling fart jokes and all the things that, I had experienced myself in that similar environment.
Normal trip, right?
Exactly. And then I actually injected dialogue. So when they woke up, what were they saying to one another? What the hell is that? And stuff like that. And so I sent him the chapter after I finished it, and I said, "Well, here's what I've written. Could you please tell me, does this accurately portray what you told me or not?" Because I was, inserting details that I believed were realistic, but I didn't want to lie. Mm-hmm. And he read the chapter and he goes, "Oh my God, that's exactly what happened. How did you know?" So that felt really, really good, because I was taking the elements that I knew to be true about that kind of situation and injecting them in the story. I mean, I was fictionalizing the bullet points he gave me, but was able to come up with, a 3,000 word chapter that captured it. And I think when you share ghost stories, your job as the writer isn't just to record the things that happened, but your story is to make it an interesting story for the reader to enjoy, because you have to care about the characters. You have to fall into the setting. And you have to, when you go on a ghost walk, you're there, you can feel it. So what I want to try to do is I want to bring the reader into that setting as much as possible so they can experience it for themselves.
How did you end up teaming up with Rhonda Parrish to co-author this book?
Well, that was a really interesting one. So in the introduction, the very first line of that chapter is in quotes, "I live near a haunted hospital." Rhonda said that to me at When Words Collide, which is a conference in Calgary. I was one of the guests of honor at that conference 2 or 3 years ago. I'm trying to remember which year it was. And we were there. It was right after the banquet. There was like an awards banquet. And afterwards, people were just hanging out and having drinks. And we were sitting with a bunch of other writers and talking. And, my head was spinning because it was the first time I had ever been a guest of honor. So it was a new thing for me. I was very delighted to be, one of the 5 authors who were, spotlit there. And when Rhonda said that, we started to share stories. And she was sharing, the house that her husband and her had bought was near this haunted hospital. She had heard some stories. She wanted to share them with me. And out of that conversation, by the end of, 20 minutes later, we're already starting to map out the concept. Well, maybe we should work on a book together. She has, as an editor, she's a writer herself. As an editor, she has edited some fiction anthologies. She was an experienced writer. She was a writer I admired, and so that sort of was born out of that. We ended up meeting together again at When Words Collide the following year, sort of having a more official meeting, because I had already had 2 books in the queue with Dundurn, my publisher in Toronto, and so I then sat together with her. We made a serious attempt to draft a proposal. We sent that in. Dundurn as they are really amazing. Basically, their main question to me is, what's your next book going to be? And pretty much they ask me, whatever it is that you want to write, just make sure, give us a good pitch, and pretty much we know we're doing a book a year with you. And so they love the pitch. We basically officially call the book, so Haunted Hospitals is the title, and the subtitle is Eerie Tales from Hospitals, Asylums, and Other Institutions, because we did have to include prisons. There's no way we could have avoided including prisons. There's a really interesting crossover between asylums and prisons, especially in the early days, where people, hardened criminals and murderers would be put in beside pickpockets, or even people who really belonged in a hospital, a psychiatric hospital, not in a criminal institution, but they got treated the same. And the horror alone in that is frightening enough without even introducing any ghosts. But of course, when you think about buildings like that where such atrocities occurred and in such deplorable conditions that people were forced to live under, you can't imagine there not being some ghostly or after image effect on the very place where those things occurred.
Can you maybe tell me a little bit about the type of person that you got these stories from, or people? Were they hospital employees, or were they maybe former patients?
For the most part, there were some patient stories. For the most part, the stories that we received were from employees or former employees of institutions. Several of the employees, even if they were former employees, were very, very careful that we had to preserve and protect their identity, because, of course, they were dealing in very sensitive personal details related to patients. And so, we fictionalized their names, so Bob, not his real name, that kind of thing. A lot of the stories, so I think probably maybe 30 to 40% of the stories came from first-person accounts of people who shared stories with us. Another 35% or 30% came from stories we had heard passed along from friends, and then the other, of course, came from researching archives of our newspapers and articles and other books. There are lots of books that include chapters on haunted places. So, I mean, it's an interesting combination when you do a book like this. A lot of time spent at the library, a lot of time spent digging into newspaper archives, and a lot of time spent, just meeting someone at a coffee shop, or a conversation on Skype, or even some of the radio programs I had been on. I think two of the stories in haunted hospitals one came out of a radio interview I did, where it was a 3 hour over midnight to 3 a.m. U.S. based syndicated show, and people were calling in from all over the U.S. And one of the gentlemen who called in, I ended up connecting with, and he shared a story that came into the book. And then I was doing a reading for Haunted Hamilton at the Hamilton Public Library near Halloween, and one of the people in the audience came up afterwards, after everyone left, and said, "Listen, I got to tell you this story." And again, that was one of the ones where he's like, well, I was working at this hospital, but you can't say who I was. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the most interesting things, because I find I get more stories when I'm not looking for them than when I'm in the depths of research.
That's interesting. Do you keep like a journal with you just in case you run into somebody?
I try to. I usually don't have something to actually write in, but what I'll usually do, I have my phone with me, so I'll send myself an email with a few tips. My girlfriend and I are actually right now in the heart of doing research for the next book called Spirits Untapped, which is going to be a collection of ghost stories about breweries and bars and restaurants. Mm-hmm. So places where you drink beer, because we're huge craft beer fans. And so when we travel, we like to go to beer places. And one of the interesting things is, when you're sitting at the bar and you're talking to them, you can find out some of the history of the building and some of that. Well, are there any interesting ghost stories there? But the thing is we're working on the book right now. We're going to put it together. It's going to come out next year. What'll happen is, after the book comes out, I'll probably get more stories that after I don't need them anymore. And so I'm always looking for, can I use that story in one of my next books? And sometimes I've gotten a story 3 or 4 years ago from somebody, but then I reach back to them and say, okay, you were telling me this story. Can I get a few more details from you? Because now I'm doing a book on hospitals. And at the time, the story you told me was really cool, but I couldn't use it anywhere. So I made a note and I came back to it. I use Google Docs. We use that a lot. Rhonda and I used that, and Liz and I are doing the same thing, where we are, we have a spreadsheet of the different places we've found, where we may have found a tip about a place, and then a link, or places, some of the traveling that we're doing is, fully intending us to go there and talk to the people. And so it's almost like a checklist of the various places that you have to go and the people you need to talk to.
Sounds like you got a really good collaborative effort set up there.
Yeah, and that's a lot of fun too, because I find for myself, I have a certain way of approaching stories, and I co-wrote Spooky Sudbury, I co-wrote Haunted Hospitals, and I'm co-writing Spirits Untapped, and I find that the co-author brings a unique voice and a unique flavor that makes the book far more interesting than just my voice throughout the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think the reader can probably appreciate that even more. Maybe I just get tired of my own voice, but I can imagine, getting different approaches to different stories keeps the book from getting monotonous. Especially, you're talking about haunted hospitals. How many times can you mention the same things over and over about, a hospital is a place where people die and are born, right? We talk about the most powerful place in our world where death and life happen, consistently. How could that not be a place that's a spectacular medium for connecting with the other world?
Well, I know I've been kind of alluding to the fact that I've worked in hospitals before, but when you talk to a hospital employee, chances are, I'd say more than half the time they're really reluctant to either listen to you, one, or come forward and share their own story, even if they might have experienced something. There's an element of ridicule, I think, in the general public, but even more so with healthcare employees. Did you get any like pushback on the people that you spoke to, or from the people you spoke to on sharing their stories?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because, as you said, these are professionals who are taking care of other human beings. Like that is their job. That is their role. They're respected. Well, they should be respected. They're not always respected, but they're in a respectable position, and they're responsible for something very, very important. Someone else's livelihood, or somebody else's health, somebody else's care. Some of them are willing to share because they've experienced some interesting things, but again, they're not, obviously, they want to protect the innocent. They want to protect their patients. They don't want to reveal. So a lot of times, if it's a story from a long, long time ago, and if the patient is no longer with us, obviously, or the story goes back in time so that it's not going to harm somebody who's alive today, they're more willing to talk about it. People are not willing, rightfully so, and I respect that. They're not willing to talk about a weird thing that happened a couple of weeks ago with a patient that's still in that hospital, or anything. I mean, a lot of the stories have to do with patients from 100 years ago, so we're kind of safe. I have in previous books, I have actually written chapters about terrible things that have happened, and people who were related to the people involved reached out and were very upset. So you have to be very, very careful. And I think hospitals and psychiatric institutions and prisons, it's not just the people involved. When you go into prisons, you're talking about the victims of the criminals involved too, right? That have a saying. So I think there were some reluctances from people that I talked to and didn't want to share stories, but you accept that and understand, and I can understand why they would be reluctant. So it's not a thing where I'm gonna push and continue to push when somebody's uncomfortable, because if they're uncomfortable talking about it, then that's not going to be a good experience for anyone.
Right, and I think one of my concerns in sharing those stories is, the potential impact on patient care. I mean, you're there, you have a job to do, and you're an advocate for patients.
Yeah.
Obviously, if a patient or a patient family is still there and it's like something fresh that happened and or related to those people, I wouldn't want to share anything. But I think one of the most memorable stories that I have was, and I'm not going to say where because I still work for hospital systems, but
Right.
So I don't want to give anything away. But I was actually at lunch, and where we sat for lunch was outside, and it bordered the ICU. And I just remember sitting there by myself, and I looked up and I saw a woman looking at me through the window, black eyes. Her mouth was wide open, and her head was kind of cocked to the side a little bit. And it just seemed like something right out of a horror movie. And I jumped up, knocked the bench over that I was sitting on, and, kind of caught my balance and looked up again, and she was gone. Well, immediately I went back around in the ICU, and I went to look in that room, and it was an empty room. And I said,
Oh God,
my gosh. I asked who the nurse was that was working right there. And I said, was somebody in here recently? And found out it was a male patient that was discharged. So it wasn't related to like a recent death or anything like that. But man, it just really shocked me. And, it's like one of those things that I can still visualize it in my brain and in my eyes. It's like burned in there. But, I kind of wonder why these things happen so often to, employees and or patients. Did you ever notice any kind of patterns in the stories that you heard?
Well, I think in some cases, some people are more sensitive to impressions, to presences, and there's kind of two ways that you can kind of look at it. Is if you believe in the afterlife and ghosts are spirits of the undead who are left trapped on this plane, haven't quite made it to the other world because there's something, some ritual, something that they're performing that they have to continue to perform because they're not finished. They don't feel a sense of completion. I mean, the other common viewpoint for what a ghost is that something happened that was so traumatic, so important, so intense that it left an impression, kind of like an image on an old cathode ray tube television, that it burned that image in time and space. And what you're seeing is the repeating reel of that thing that happened. So there is no ghost, there's no spiritual presence there. It's just something burned on space and time that just replays. And so the people who see those things are more in tune or sensitive to those elements, are more, in some ways open to perceiving those things than others. No different than you think about somebody who's into wine and you've become attuned to be able to taste certain things and notes and flavors and, craft beer or whatever the case may be. We were just at an old cigar shop in Old Town San Diego. And the gentleman who was there, I'm not a cigar guy. I was looking to pick up something for a friend. And there's hundreds of different cigars there with all the different nuances and flavors that somebody like me would never notice, but a cigar advocate would. Just like I can tell the difference between different types of IPAs, never mind the difference between an IPA and a wheat beer, for example. So people are in. See, I got all sidetracked on these fun drinking things. But
I was going to say you lost me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Let's go have a drink. No, but I mean the same thing is right when you're in tune or sensitive to certain things. They're more in tune than the average person. So think about people who are healthcare professionals who have to be in tune with their patients' needs and cares. They're very sensitive to what's going on. How could they then not be sensitive to some of the other things, whether it's a spirit who has not been able to leave this plane, or it's some time, an impression in time and space. So when you looked and you saw that, your mind, the moment you were in, you were, relaxed enough or whatever it was to be able to see that you don't always see it because maybe you're too busy and you're rushing around working on something. I find it very interesting. It's almost as interesting to figure out something about the person who's experiencing that and what was going on with them that allowed them to perceive that at that time. The other question then is, did somebody else see that woman? Where is she from? Who is she? How did this, why is she there? There's so many ways you can approach these stories. One of the challenges I have as a writer of these books is I have to tell myself to stop researching because I get so interested in wanting to know more that I fall down these rabbit holes of interest. And then I realize okay, all right, I'm good. I think I have enough here for a good story. I don't need to, I'd who is she? Why does she look like that? Why is her mouth like that? Why are her eyes so dark? What's the story? And I'm sure there's always something interesting when you can get those elements, if you ever find them.
Right, and I don't know that I ever would. I think the extent of my investigation lasted until my lunch break was up. But
yeah, because you were busy, right?
Right. But it's funny. I have seen employees of hospitals. I remember a nurse who had a photograph where she was kind of sitting at the end of the hallway, and to her right there was a patient room, and the door had a window in it, and you could see in the photo there was a little girl looking through this window. Now this was very odd to me. This was not a pediatric hospital, nor had it ever been. To anyone's knowledge, there hadn't been any certainly deaths of pediatric patients there. So right. I guess I'm wondering in what you've come across, have you kind of seen anything like that maybe doesn't necessarily match up with the history of the building, or just something that was off?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's funny you mentioned that, right? There's the image of the ghostly child, but there was no evidence in history of anything that matched that. That does happen. And so in some of the stories, you kind of you you speculate. Well, this used to be a home. People used to live here before it was a hospital. And in some of the cases, some of the stories in haunted hospitals where this is now a home, but it used to be a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Or this used to be an orphanage, and now it's a hospital. And there was a fire, and children died in that fire. And so some of the stories are related to hearing the screams of children in the middle of the night. Yeah, it's interesting, but again, that's why the history becomes so important, because you're at a place now that may be a restaurant, but it used to be a doctor's residence. I think of that as the used to be in Ottawa, for example,
Mm-hmm.
was a Becta, which is a wine and food bar, and it used to be Friday's Roast Beef House. And when it was Friday's Roast Beef House in the 80s, was when the ghost stories came out. Staff would feel things and experience things. And when you looked into it, that was a house from a very prestigious doctor who used to treat patients in that building. And that's an interesting element, because you wonder, are these the ghosts of patients who were in that building when it was a doctor's residence? And and back then, you would visit the doctor there if they didn't do house calls. So it's really interesting. There's as Shakespeare said, there's more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So I always wonder, when we look at the things that the ghostly images and the things that are experienced, there's so many untold stories in so many buildings. There's so many people who had lived there or been through there before than were ever really properly documented. I mean, hotels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in one right now. How many tens of thousands of people have slept in this room, have been here, how many traumas and experiences have been experienced here where I am now? I can't help but believe that there's all kinds of untold stories, some of which created a ripple in time. It's so I get so fascinated by these possibilities.
Well, I think one of the things that pops into mind is, I've heard, they talk about residual hauntings versus, intelligent. I've heard the theories that, maybe it's not necessarily the spirit of a deceased person, but something, like you said, traumatic happened to someone, and it might be someone that was living that left some kind of an imprint.
Yeah.
And I guess, are there any other theories that you might have heard of in the writing of any of your books that might explain maybe another potential angle?
No, I think like you said, the intelligent hauntings and the residual. I think residual in many ways. I mean, I've been so fascinated by the concept of residual hauntings that one of my absolute favorite short fiction stories that I've written is called Spirits.
Mm-hmm.
And the subtitle for that story is a line that a character says is, "You don't have to die to leave your spirit in a place." And the concept is that something happens in a place that's so important to you that you actually leave a piece of your spirit behind. And so the ghost that people see there is actually you, even though you're somewhere else, you're wandering around, you're okay, but your spirit is still trapped there. That's sort of a cross between the residual and the afterlife spirit. I don't think I've, in my research, that I've found a story quite like that. But you have to wonder, does that, the woman you saw, or does that thing that was experienced, does it actually have to be the spirit of a dead person, or can it be the spirit of a person who's still alive, because it's that impression that they left there, and that hasn't left, and it's still there. Again, I really like the concept of and we're not going to see that as much with the new televisions, but it used to happen with the old television sets from my youth, where you would get that ghostly image burned on the TV. Like, we used to play video games, Atari, and in television.
Right.
And if you left it on for long enough on a certain screen, when you paused it, to go have dinner or something like that, sometimes you would still see the impression burned on the television, and your dad to get mad at you.
I do remember those days.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to spoil too much of the book, but was there a particular, story that really stood out to you, or maybe was more compelling, that you'd like to share with us a little bit about?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the stories which came, and it's from Hamilton, the city that I live in, and it was from a former security guard who had worked at the old psychiatric hospital, and this was after the psychiatric hospital was closed. And two really disturbing things, it just still chills me when I hear them, is he was walking down the hall and he was just checking, he was just doing the rounds. There was like old buildings that were closed down, but he still had to do the rounds because there were parts of that campus that were still active psychiatric hospital, and then this was the old building. And as he was going through the old building, he thought he heard something in one of the rooms that of this vacant building, and he opened the door, and there were two patients standing there, and they turned, and one of them looked at him and then looked back at the other patient and said, "I told you he would hear us." And, and that's a freak. And then they disappeared, which just it was just kind of chilling. And then later on, as he's walking in an underground tunnel between the old haunted psychiatric part of the building and the newer one, he felt a presence that he described like a wind tunnel. That he felt something coming down the wind tunnel, and he could feel the air pressure change, and he felt something pushing at his back really, really hard, like a wind, but there was no wind there. It just was pushing at him, and there was like palpable tension in the air, and he described it as it was like there were thousands of people rushing to get out, trying desperately in a panicked motion to get out because he was heading towards the exit. And that pushed him so hard, and then it stopped, and he ran. He left the campus. He went 2 blocks away to. This was back when payphones were on city street corners, and he called his boss and said, "I quit," and he left and never went back because he just couldn't bear the thought of what that was trying to escape. So those were two. I guess because they're close to home. And I've actually been, the building's locked and it's got asbestos and all that stuff, so you can't go inside. I've been outside, I've walked around, taken hundreds of pictures there. I used to live in that neighborhood. And so to hear those stories about that place, and again, such a rich history of that psychiatric institution in Hamilton, just to hear those stories, they still chill me. And maybe they stuck with me more because he and I sat together over coffee, and he shared those stories, so they maybe had a more personal impact on me than just reading about them from many of the stories that I wasn't fortunate enough to talk to someone firsthand.
Wow, that's very interesting stories. I feel like just talking to you, you're setting a good picture in my mind. So I'm really excited for your book to come out.
Well, I can't wait to send you one as soon as the book gets published.
Great. Now, I do know that most people who, eventually are interested in the paranormal, typically it's because they've had paranormal experiences of their own. Have you personally had any experiences?
That's an interesting question, because I used to say in interviews, no, I've never experienced any paranormal. I've never seen a ghost. So I have still never seen a ghost or heard a ghost. But a couple years ago, I was in Halifax, which is on the east coast of Canada. And I was at a hotel that was actually, I learned later, allegedly haunted, because I'm kind of scared to stay in haunted places myself. I'm a big chicken. And I got in, and it was like that mid-afternoon where I hadn't had lunch, and it wasn't quite yet dinner. So I got in from the airport, probably like 3 o'clock, and I get into the hotel room, and I plug in my laptop, and I just do some quick email, and I plug in my phone, because my phone's mostly dead because I'd been traveling, and I plug in the phone to the lamp, the bedside lamp at the hotel, and it's one of the bedside lamps that there's a plug as well as the switch. So I go to plug it in, and I'm not getting any power. So then I turn on the lamp, or I I press the button to turn on the lamp. The lamp doesn't come on. I went, oh no, okay. And I look down and I see, oh, the plug has come unplugged. So I take the plug and I stick it in the wall. And it's a good solid take. It sticks right in. Great, no problem. The lamp comes on, charging my phone. Okay, great. So to charge my phone, and then over at the desk farther away from the bed, or at the foot of the bed, I'm doing my email for a bit, for maybe half an hour, just to get some juice back on my phone. Then I go down to a local bar, check out some craft beer, have a burger. And I left the light on because it was in the springtime. It was going to start to get dark relatively earlier. And I don't like coming back to a hotel room that's dark because I'm a big chicken. I'm by myself. And I come back into the hotel room maybe 5:30, 6 o'clock. And it's just getting to be dusky. And I open the door and there's no light in my room. And I go, oh, that's weird. Maybe the maid came in and cleaned up or did whatever. And I come around and the light's unplugged. I'm like, all right, no. I'm thinking, oh, maybe they forgot to vacuum or something. They came in, they unplugged, they plugged in the vacuum, they vacuumed, then they forgot to plug it back in. And that's probably what had happened before. Perfectly plausible explanation. So I went out. I had a lunch or a dinner meeting with some authors, and then again went out. Came back late at night. Plugged in my phone at the bedside lamp. So I had to do a talk the next morning. And when I'm traveling, I have to do a talk early in a different time zone. I'm always worried about oversleeping and missing. So I always wake up constantly in the middle of the night, hours before I have to be up. And so I had my phone plugged in beside me in the bedside lamp. And when I went to bed, and I woke up around 3 in the morning. So I lean over and I press the phone, just on the iPhone where it shows you the time. It seems like 3:15 or something in the morning. But then I looked up in the top corner, and I saw that the power was at 30%, but it had been plugged in all night, and it was still plugged in. And then I turned the phone. With the glow of the phone, you can kind of see in the dark.
Right.
And I looked down and I saw that the cord had come unplugged in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. And so a huge chill ran down my spine. And I'm thinking, somebody snuck into my room, crawled around the side of the bed, pulled it out. Was there a giant rat that just it came in and would? I still have no idea how that happened. Scared the bejesus out of me. And I decided from that point on I was not going to plug that in again because something did not want that plugged in. So the short answer to your question is yes, I've had something weird that I can't explain, that maybe it's explained by some paranormal phenomenon happened, but something didn't want that cord to be plugged in. And so I just left it because I had to stay one more night there. And I did have to actually get quite a number of beers into me before I could fall asleep the next day.
You didn't ask for a new room, huh?
No, I didn't actually. I never thought of that. I just, that was an interesting one. Maybe, hey, if it was a haunted hotel, maybe something was going to follow me around.
Wow, that's a great story. Well, tell us when you can purchase, when and where you can purchase a copy of your book coming out.
So Haunted Hospitals is interesting. It's going to have about 30% of the stories will be from Canada. Another 30% were going to be from across the United States. And then another 30% or so will be rest of world. So like my book, Tomes of Terror, The Haunted Bookstores and Libraries, I can imagine that for locales where there are haunted hospitals or allegedly haunted hospitals, those bookstores will be more likely to get it. I mean, you'll be able to get it from Amazon, from Barnes & Noble, from Books A Million, and any of the online retailers are gonna have it. It's going to be distributed through major Ingram, which is the world's largest wholesaler. My publisher distributes through them. And I imagine there will probably be some places, some towns and cities in the U.S. that will have it. I mean, there's places in California, in Wolf Manor, in Clovis, for example. There's places in Colorado. There's places in Illinois. There's stories from all over the place, and then there's a final chapter that Rhonda and I put together, and there were so many prison stories. We couldn't dig into them in detail, but we did very abbreviated stories of haunted prisons across the U.S. and Canada, as well as in the U.K. So it's going to be available in March 2017, and I'm sure you can order it through your favorite local bookstore or at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc., whatever the large retailer is that you shop online with.
Well, I very much look forward to that. Where can we go to follow you and maybe look at your other books you've written or the current projects you're working on?
Yeah, sure. My website is markleslie.ca. You can follow me on Twitter at Mark Leslie. As well, I've got a Facebook page, Mark Leslie Author, as well as there's actually Facebook pages for my previous books. So there's Creepy Capital, the Ottawa book, Spooky Sudbury, Haunted Hamilton, and Tomes of Terror, the haunted bookstores and libraries. And again, the reason I have separate Facebook pages for those is because the Ottawa book is mostly for people who care and are interested in Ottawa or Hamilton or whatever the cities are. Same thing, when haunted hospitals come out, there will probably be a dedicated Facebook page for that, because as we find new stories that are in the book or more stories about places that are in the book, we'll be able to share them to that Facebook page so people who appreciate those stories can kind of follow along.
Wonderful. Well, I certainly look forward to it, and this has been an excellent conversation. I've quite enjoyed it. I'm going to put all those links in my show notes for everybody who's listening to go check out and maybe get some of your work. And thank you again for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks for sharing such a fantastic story that I've got to archive now and see where and when I can use that one.
Well, if you need any more, I've got a lot more. I'm rich with those stories. Yeah, maybe
we need to talk, you and I.
You can educate me about beer.
Oh, that sounds like fun. Maybe I'll buy you some beer and we can hear some more fun stories.
Sounds good. Well, you have a great rest of your day, Mark.
You too, Jeremy. Thanks.
All right. I want to send a huge thank you out to Mark for joining us today on Deviatus. As usual, I'm going to have all of the links mentioned on my show notes. You can find those at deviatus.com/Leslie. If you have any questions about the show or want to get in touch with me, you can contact me at deviatuspod@gmail.com. And to stay current on updates about the show, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at deviatuspod, or come find me on our Facebook page available through the link on the website at deviatus.com. So thank you for joining us and have an excellent week.